The morning fog settled heavily over the M4 motorway, creating an ethereal backdrop for what would become an extraordinary day in Richard Blackwood's life. At 61, the successful CEO of Blackwood Publishing had grown accustomed to the solitary drives between London and Bristol, using these moments to reflect on the manuscripts that crossed his desk and the years of memories accumulated in both cities. His silver Bentley Continental GT purred smoothly along the motorway, its elegant form cutting through the autumn mist. The traffic had been unusually light that morning, matching his contemplative mood as he headed to Bristol for the opening of a new independent bookshop, one of many he had helped establish through his publishing house's community outreach program. The gentle vibration of his phone interrupted his thoughts. Sarah, his assistant, was probably calling about the speech he was meant to give at the opening. However, before he could reach for the device, blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror, accompanied by the familiar sound of a police siren. Richard guided his car to the hard shoulder, maintaining his usual composure. He had always been meticulous about following traffic regulations, but these routine checks were part of life on British motorways. As he waited, he retrieved his license from his wallet, the gold wedding band on his finger catching the weak morning light, a constant reminder of Elizabeth, his wife of 30 years, who had left this world 3 years ago. The sound of boots on tarmac approached his window, and Richard lowered it smoothly, prepared to greet the officer with his usual politeness. But the words caught in his throat as he turned to face the police officer. Time seemed to stop, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. Standing beside his car was a young woman in her mid-20s, her police uniform neat and professional, but it wasn't her attire that had caused Richard's reaction. It was her face, a face he knew as well as his own reflection, one he had gazed at lovingly for 3 decades. The same high cheekbones, the identical shade of hazel eyes, even the way she held her head slightly tilted to the right. It was like seeing a ghost, or rather, seeing Elizabeth as she had appeared in the photographs from her university days. "Good morning, sir," the officer spoke, her voice carrying the same soft West Country lilt that had first attracted Richard to Elizabeth all those years ago. "I'm Officer Claire Hamilton. Could I see your license and registration, please?" Hamilton, Elizabeth's maiden name. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he handed over his documents, his mind racing with possibilities that seemed too fantastic to contemplate. He watched as Officer Hamilton reviewed his information, her movements precise and professional, yet achingly familiar in their grace. "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Blackwood," she said, returning his documents. "We're conducting routine checks today. Would you mind if I asked where you're heading?" Richard cleared his throat, trying to maintain his composure. "Bristol. I'm opening a new bookshop there this afternoon." Something flickered in Officer Hamilton's eyes. Interest, perhaps. "A bookshop? Are you in publishing, then?" "Yes, I own Blackwood Publishing," Richard replied, studying her face carefully. "We specialize in contemporary literature and poetry." "Really?" Her professional demeanor softened slightly. "I've actually submitted some of my writing to Blackwood Publishing. Small world, isn't it?" Richard's heart skipped a beat. Elizabeth had been a writer too, her poetry touching hearts across Britain. The coincidences were mounting, becoming impossible to ignore. "Indeed it is," he managed to say. "What kind of writing do you do?" "Poetry mainly," Claire answered, and Richard noticed she was unconsciously touching the small notebook visible in her uniform pocket, exactly as Elizabeth used to do with her own notebooks. "But I should let you get on your way, Mr. Blackwood. Drive safely." As she walked back to her patrol car, Richard remained still, his mind whirling with questions. The encounter had lasted barely 5 minutes, but it had shaken his world to its core. He watched in his mirror as Claire's police car pulled away, disappearing into the morning fog. With trembling fingers, he reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. Margaret, Elizabeth's mother, would be having her morning tea right now, as she always did. The phone rang twice before her familiar voice answered. "Richard, is everything all right?" Margaret's concern was evident. He rarely called this early. "Margaret, I need to ask you something," he said, his voice barely steady. "Did Elizabeth ever... was there ever..." He paused, gathering his courage. "Did Elizabeth have a child before we met?" The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "How did you find out about Claire?" Margaret's words hung in the air like the morning fog outside Richard's car. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, anchoring himself to something solid as his world tilted on its axis. After 3 decades of marriage, after sharing every secret, every joy, and every sorrow, how could he not have known about this? "Perhaps you should come over for tea," Margaret suggested, her voice gentle but trembling. "There's much to tell, and none of it should be said over the phone." Richard glanced at his watch. The bookshop opening wasn't until 3 in the afternoon. "I'll be there in 30 minutes, he said, already signaling to rejoin the motorway traffic. Margaret's cottage sat on the outskirts of Bath, a charming stone building surrounded by an immaculate garden that Elizabeth had helped design years ago. As Richard pulled into the gravel driveway, he noticed fresh roses blooming in the beds, Elizabeth's favorites, the same shade of pink she had carried in their wedding bouquet. The door opened before he could knock, and Margaret stood there looking older and more fragile than he remembered. Her silver hair was neatly styled as always, but her hands fidgeted with her cardigan buttons, a sure sign of distress. "Come in, dear," she said, leading him to the conservatory where morning light filtered through the glass ceiling, illuminating a tea service already set out. 2 cups, a plate of shortbread, and a small photo album that Richard had never seen before. They sat in silence as Margaret poured the tea, her movements deliberate and measured. Finally, she opened the album to the first page, revealing a photograph of Elizabeth at 19, her belly slightly rounded beneath a flowing summer dress. "It was 1981, Margaret began, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Elizabeth was in her first year at university, studying English literature. She met a young man, James Turner, at a poetry reading. They had a whirlwind romance, but when she told him about the baby, he disappeared. Just packed up and left university without a word." Richard stared at the photograph, seeing hints of both Elizabeth and Claire in the young woman's face. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" Margaret sighed, turning to another page that showed a tiny baby, swaddled in a pink blanket. "She wanted to, so many times, but she feared it would change how you saw her. The adoption was closed. It was different back then. Elizabeth was told she couldn't have any contact until the child turned 18, and even then, only if the child wanted it." She pulled out a bundle of sealed envelopes from the back of the album, each one addressed simply to "my daughter" in Elizabeth's distinctive handwriting. She wrote a letter every year on Claire's birthday. Never sent them, of course, but she couldn't bear not to write them. It was her way of staying connected. Richard picked up one of the letters, recognizing the paper from Elizabeth's favorite stationery set. Did she ever try to find Claire? "She hired a private investigator when Claire turned 18, Margaret revealed, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Found out she had been adopted by a wonderful couple, the Hamiltons. Claire had kept their name, was doing well in school, interested in writing just like her mother. But Elizabeth, she decided not to make contact. Said she didn't have the right to disrupt Claire's life, not when she had loving parents and a happy home." Richard thought about the young police officer he'd met that morning, about her poetry submissions to his publishing house. "She's a writer," he said softly, "like Elizabeth, and she looks exactly like Elizabeth did at that age." Margaret nodded, a small smile breaking through her tears. "Nature has a way of asserting itself, doesn't it? Elizabeth would see her sometimes, you know. Not directly. She'd attend Claire's school plays from the back row, watch her university graduation from a distance. She kept a scrapbook of Claire's achievements. The girl won several poetry competitions in school. Did she ever know? Does Claire know she's adopted?" "Yes. The Hamiltons were always open with her about it. They're good people, Richard. They gave Claire all the love and support Elizabeth hoped she would have." Margaret hesitated, then added, "Elizabeth's last wish was that these letters would find their way to Claire someday. She made me promise to keep them safe." Richard sat back in his chair, his tea growing cold and forgotten. His mind was racing with possibilities, with the strange twists of fate that had brought him face to face with his stepdaughter on a foggy morning on the M4. He thought about Elizabeth, carrying this secret for so long, writing those birthday letters year after year, watching her daughter from afar. "The bookshop opening today," he said suddenly. "It's featuring local poets. Claire mentioned submitting work to Blackwood Publishing." He trailed off, realizing the implications. Margaret's eyes widened. "You don't think—" "I need to check something," Richard said, pulling out his phone and quickly accessing his company's submission database. A few taps brought up recent entries, and there it was. Claire Hamilton, 3 poems submitted last month. He opened the first one, titled Echoes, and began to read. His hands began to shake as he recognized the style, the unique way of structuring verses that had made Elizabeth's poetry so distinctive. Claire hadn't just inherited her mother's looks, she had inherited her voice, her way of seeing the world through a poet's eyes. "She writes exactly like Elizabeth," he whispered, showing Margaret the phone screen. "The same techniques, the same patterns. How is that possible?" Margaret smiled through her tears. "Some things run deeper than teaching, Richard. Some things are in the blood, in the soul." She touched the stack of letters gently. "What are you going to do?" Richard looked out at the garden Elizabeth had loved so much, at the roses she had planted and the paths she had walked. The answer came to him with perfect clarity. "I'm going to do what Elizabeth couldn't. I'm going to find a way to give Claire these letters, to tell her about her mother. But first," he paused, a plan forming in his mind. "First, I need to accept her poetry submission. It's time for Claire Hamilton to become a published poet, just like her mother." The Bristol Bookmark's grand opening drew a larger crowd than Richard had anticipated. Local literary enthusiasts, aspiring writers, and curious passers-by filled the carefully designed space, admiring the oak shelves and comfortable reading nooks that made the bookshop feel like a second home. But Richard's attention was focused on the door, watching, waiting. He had personally sent an email to Claire Hamilton that morning, congratulating her on the acceptance of her poetry submission and inviting her to the opening. The message had been carefully crafted, professional yet warm, mentioning that he remembered their brief encounter on the motorway and would be delighted to discuss her work in person. As he prepared to give his opening speech, he spotted her entering the shop. Claire had exchanged her police uniform for a navy blue dress, her hair falling loose around her shoulders in the same waves that Elizabeth's had. She carried a leather-bound notebook, another echo of her mother that made Richard's heart ache. "Welcome, everyone," he began, forcing himself to focus on the crowd. "Today marks not just the opening of a new bookshop, but the continuation of a legacy. Blackwood Publishing has always believed in nurturing new voices, in finding those unique perspectives that make literature a bridge between souls." As he spoke about the importance of local literary communities, Richard noticed Claire taking notes in her notebook, her head tilted in concentration, exactly as Elizabeth used to do during poetry readings. The mannerism was so familiar that he almost lost his train of thought. After the formal speeches, as the crowd mingled and explored the shop, Claire approached him. "Mr. Blackwood, I wanted to thank you for the invitation and for accepting my submission. I still can't quite believe it." "Your work deserves to be published," Richard replied, gesturing toward the coffee bar at the back of the shop. "Would you like to discuss it over coffee? I have some thoughts about your collection that I'd love to share." They settled into a quiet corner, and Richard pulled out a copy of her manuscript that he'd been studying since dawn. "Your poem Echoes particularly caught my attention. The way you structure your verses using internal rhyme as a subtle thread rather than an obvious pattern, it's quite sophisticated." Claire's eyes lit up with surprise and pleasure. "Most people don't notice that. I've always felt that poetry should whisper rather than shout its rhythms, like a heartbeat under the skin of the words." Richard nearly spilled his coffee. Elizabeth had used those exact words in her first poetry collection's introduction. "That's a beautiful way to put it," he managed to say. "Have you been writing long?" "Since I was a child," Claire replied, absently touching her notebook. "My parents, my adoptive parents, they've always encouraged it. Dad built me a writing desk when I was 12, and Mum made sure I had beautiful notebooks. They're wonderful people." She paused, then added more quietly, "They've never tried to hide the fact that I was adopted. I've always known there was another story out there, another part of me." Richard nodded, treading carefully. "And have you ever thought about exploring that story?" "Sometimes," Claire admitted. "More often lately, actually, especially when I write. It's silly, but I sometimes wonder if my birth mother was a writer too, if that's where this comes from." She laughed softly. "Sorry, I don't know why I'm telling you all this." "Never apologize for sharing what matters to you," Richard said gently. "Actually, I wonder if you'd be interested in participating in a special project we're planning. We're putting together an anthology of new voices alongside established poets, creating dialogues between different generations of writers. Your work would fit perfectly." Claire's face lit up. Really? That sounds incredible, but... She hesitated. I'm not sure how I'd balance it with my police work. The anthology won't be published for 6 months, Richard explained. We'll be holding weekly workshops, mentoring sessions, collaborative events. You could participate as your schedule allows. He paused, then added, Actually, I have some books at the office I think you'd find interesting. Collections that share similar themes and techniques to your work. Would you like to come by next week to take a look? I'd love to, Claire replied enthusiastically. I have a day off on Wednesday. As they arranged the details, Richard noticed Claire had the same habit of drawing small stars in the corners of her pages as she wrote, another of Elizabeth's unconscious traditions. Every new similarity he discovered felt like both a gift and a challenge, each one making the truth more apparent while making its revelation more delicate. They spent the next hour discussing poetry, contemporary literature, and Claire's aspirations. She revealed that she had chosen to become a police officer because she wanted to help people, to be there for them in difficult moments, but writing had always been her passion, her way of making sense of the world. Sometimes I feel like there are 2 different lives inside me, she confessed. The structured, disciplined police officer and the poet who sees metaphors in traffic lights and finds stories in strangers' faces. Does that sound strange? Not at all, Richard assured her, thinking of Elizabeth's journals where she had written almost the same thing. The best writers often live in multiple worlds. It gives them a unique perspective, a deeper understanding of human nature. As the bookshop event wound down and Claire prepared to leave, she turned back to Richard. Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Blackwood. It feels like something important is beginning. Richard watched her walk away, her notebook tucked under her arm, and thought about the letters waiting in Margaret's cottage. You have no idea, he whispered to himself, already planning the careful path ahead that would lead to the truth. Wednesday arrived with a gentle autumn rain that made Blackwood Publishing's offices seem even more welcoming than usual. Richard had spent the weekend carefully selecting books from his private collection, including, hidden among them, Elizabeth's first poetry collection, published under her maiden name, Hamilton. He had arrived early to arrange everything in the conference room, the books, fresh coffee, and a selection of Elizabeth's unpublished works that he kept in his office. Each piece was chosen to create a path of literary breadcrumbs, subtle connections that might awaken something in Claire's consciousness without overwhelming her. When his assistant announced Claire's arrival, Richard found himself adjusting his tie nervously. She entered the conference room wearing casual clothes, her police uniform and authority replaced by jeans and a soft sweater that made her look even more like her mother. I've pulled together quite a collection for you, Richard said, gesturing to the books spread across the large oak table. Everything from contemporary poets to some lesser-known gems from previous decades. I thought we could start with works that share similar themes to your poetry. Claire approached the table with evident excitement, running her fingers lightly over the book spines. This is amazing. I don't even know where to start. Perhaps with this one, Richard suggested, carefully sliding Elizabeth's collection toward her. It's from the early 1980s, but I think you'll find the style surprisingly familiar. Claire picked up the book, studying the cover. Whispered Rhythms by Elizabeth Hamilton, she read aloud, then looked up with surprise. Hamilton, any relation? It's not an uncommon name, Richard said softly, watching her face. Why don't you read the first poem? As Claire began to read, Richard observed the subtle changes in her expression. He knew the moment she recognized something of herself in the words. Her eyes widened slightly, and her free hand moved unconsciously to her own notebook. This is extraordinary, she whispered. The way she structures the verses, the internal rhythms, it's exactly how I... She looked up at Richard, a question in her eyes. How did you know I would connect with this? A publisher develops an eye for patterns, Richard replied carefully. When I read your work, I was reminded of Elizabeth's style. She had a unique way of weaving emotions through her imagery, just as you do. Claire sat down, completely absorbed in the book. Listen to this line. Memory lives in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause before rain falls, in the silence after goodbye. That's exactly how I think about memory in my own work. I've never read anyone who expressed it quite like this before. Richard watched as she continued reading, noting how she unconsciously mirrored Elizabeth's reading posture. One elbow on the table, head tilted slightly, occasionally mouthing words silently as she read. Each shared mannerism was another thread connecting mother and daughter across time. What happened to her? Claire asked suddenly. Elizabeth Hamilton. Did she write more collections? Richard's heart tightened. She continued writing throughout her life, though she published under a different name after marriage. She was an extraordinary woman. You knew her? Claire's attention sharpened. Yes, Richard admitted, choosing his words carefully. She was an important part of Blackwood Publishing's history. Actually, many of these unpublished works are hers. He gestured to a stack of manuscripts. I thought you might be interested in seeing how her style evolved. Claire reached for the manuscripts with evident enthusiasm, but Richard noticed her stifling a yawn. Sorry, she said, looking embarrassed. Long night shift yesterday. There's fresh coffee, Richard offered, moving to the coffee service. How do you take it? Milk, no sugar, Claire replied, already immersed in Elizabeth's words. And she looked up with a slight smile. Maybe a chocolate biscuit if you have one. I always need something sweet with coffee. Richard froze momentarily by the coffee service, his back to Claire. It had been Elizabeth's exact preference, right down to the chocolate biscuits she'd always kept in her desk drawer. Recovering quickly, he prepared their coffees, adding a selection of biscuits to the tray. As the afternoon progressed, they discussed poetry techniques, shared favorite verses, and Richard carefully noted every parallel between Claire's literary instincts and her mother's. Claire was drawn to the same themes, used similar metaphors, even marked interesting passages with the same small symbols in the margins. I should probably head home soon, Claire said eventually, looking regretful. But would it be possible to borrow some of these, especially the Elizabeth Hamilton collection? Of course, Richard replied. Take whatever interests you. And Claire, he hesitated, then continued, if you'd like, we could make this a regular thing. Weekly discussions about poetry, writing techniques. I could share more of Elizabeth's unpublished works with you. Claire's face lit up. I'd love that. It feels important somehow, like I'm discovering something I've been looking for without knowing it. As he watched her gather her borrowed books, carefully placing Elizabeth's collection on top of the pile, Richard thought about the letters waiting in Margaret's cottage, about the truth waiting to be revealed. The afternoon had confirmed what he already knew. Claire wasn't just Elizabeth's daughter by blood. She was her mother's daughter in spirit, in creativity, in the very way she saw the world. Same time next week? Claire asked from the doorway. Perfect, Richard replied, already planning which of Elizabeth's works to share next, carefully constructing the bridge that would eventually lead Claire to her true inheritance, not just her mother's poetry, but her history, her identity, and the love that had never stopped waiting for her. The autumn weeks fell into a comfortable rhythm. Every Wednesday afternoon, Claire would arrive at Blackwood Publishing, sometimes still in her police uniform, sometimes in casual clothes, but always carrying her notebook and an eagerness to discuss literature. Richard found himself looking forward to these sessions with an intensity that surprised him. Today, Claire had arrived with excitement radiating from her face. I had the most incredible dream last night, she announced, pulling out her notebook. I woke up at 3 a.m. and had to write it down. It turned into a poem and, well, I'd love your opinion. Richard settled into his usual chair, accepting the notebook with careful hands. The handwriting was so similar to Elizabeth's that it made his breath catch. He began to read. In dreams I walk through rooms I've never seen, touch books whose titles fade like morning mist, and hear a voice that feels forever known, singing lullabies in shades of dawn. The mirror shows a face that's half my own, features borrowed from a stranger's grace, and in the space between what's lost and found, I trace the outline of my history. He had to pause, gripping the notebook tighter to steady his hands. The poem was about identity, about searching for origins, written in exactly the same style Elizabeth had used in her journal entries about giving up her baby. It's beautiful, he managed to say. The imagery is particularly striking. This line about the mirror, it's very powerful. Claire leaned forward, her hazel eyes, Elizabeth's eyes, bright with enthusiasm. I've been having these dreams ever since I started reading Elizabeth Hamilton's work. It's strange, but I feel so connected to her writing, like she's expressing thoughts I've always had but never knew how to voice. Richard placed the notebook carefully on the table between them. Sometimes writers can touch something universal, something that speaks to our deepest selves. It's more than that, Claire said thoughtfully. Ever since my parents told me I was adopted, I've had this feeling of another life running parallel to mine. Reading Elizabeth's poetry, it's like finding echoes of that life. Does that sound crazy? Not at all, Richard replied softly. Actually, I have something special to share with you today. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a leather journal. This was Elizabeth's personal notebook. She used to write about her creative process, her inspirations. He opened the journal to a carefully chosen page where Elizabeth had written about her pregnancy, though without explicit details. The entry spoke of connection, of love, of hopes for a future she couldn't be part of. Claire read in silence, her finger tracing the handwritten words. She writes about loss here, Claire observed. About loving someone she couldn't keep. It's heartbreaking, but beautiful. She looked up at Richard. You knew her well, didn't you? Elizabeth. Richard nodded, choosing his words carefully. Very well, she was my wife. Claire's eyes widened. Your wife? But she published under Hamilton. That was her maiden name. She published her first collection before we married. Richard paused, watching Claire process this information. She was an extraordinary woman. Actually, she's the one who started our publishing house's mentorship program. What was she like? Claire asked softly, her hand still resting on Elizabeth's journal. Richard smiled, memories washing over him. Brilliant. Compassionate. She had this habit of collecting beautiful notebooks, but would only write in them when she found a story worthy of their pages. She loved chocolate biscuits with her coffee, could spend hours in bookshops, and always stopped to help strangers, even when we were running late. Claire listened intently, unconsciously mirroring one of Elizabeth's most characteristic gestures, twirling a strand of hair around her finger while deep in thought. When did you lose her? 3 years ago, Richard replied. But she left behind so much, her poetry, her journals, her way of seeing the world. Sometimes I find new pieces of her wisdom tucked away in unexpected places. Claire was quiet for a moment, then said, I wish I could have met her. It feels like she would have understood certain things about me that I don't even understand myself. Richard felt his heart constrict. The moment felt ripe for revelation, but he knew it wasn't quite time. Claire needed to discover more pieces of the puzzle herself first. Actually, he said carefully, I'm organizing a special exhibition of Elizabeth's work at the Bristol Literary Museum next month. Personal items, unpublished poems, photographs. Would you be interested in helping me curate it? Your perspective as a young poet who connects with her work would be invaluable. Claire's face lit up. Really? I'd be honored, but... She hesitated. Are you sure? This seems so personal. I'm sure, Richard said firmly. Elizabeth believed in creating bridges between people through literature. I think she would have wanted this. As Claire left that afternoon, clutching Elizabeth's journal that Richard had insisted she borrow, he watched her walk away with mixed emotions. Soon, he would need to tell her the truth. But first, he needed to contact the Hamiltons, Claire's adoptive parents. They deserved to know what was coming, to be part of this unfolding story. He picked up his phone and dialed Margaret's number. Margaret, I think it's time to meet the Hamiltons. Claire needs all her family around her for what's coming next. The Hamiltons' home in suburban Bristol was exactly as Margaret had described it, a warm, welcoming Victorian house with a well-tended garden and large bay windows filled with books. Richard stood at the door, his heart pounding as if he were a teenager, rather than a successful businessman in his 60s. Grace and Thomas Hamilton had agreed to meet him after receiving his letter explaining who he was and his connection to Claire's birth mother. Now standing on their doorstep, Richard wondered how they would react to the full story. The door opened to reveal a couple in their early 60s, Grace with kind eyes and silver-streaked dark hair, and Thomas, tall and distinguished with wire-rimmed glasses. They had raised Claire with love for 25 years, given her a home, supported her dreams. Richard felt a surge of gratitude toward them. Mr. Blackwood, Grace said warmly, extending her hand. Please come in. We have so much to talk about. They settled in a comfortable living room where family photographs covered the walls. Richard's eyes were drawn to them immediately. Claire, through the years, from a toddler to a graduate in police uniform, always smiling, always loved. Claire's told us about her mentorship with you, Thomas said, passing Richard a cup of tea. She's incredibly excited about it. Says she's finally finding her voice as a writer. She's finding more than that, Grace added softly. She's finding pieces of herself. We've always known this day would come. Richard set down his teacup carefully. You've done an amazing job with Claire. Elizabeth would have been so grateful. Elizabeth, Grace repeated the name thoughtfully. We knew her first name from the adoption papers, but nothing else. Claire was too young to remember, but when she first started writing poetry, I wondered, nature has a way of showing itself. She was an incredible poet, Richard said, reaching into his briefcase. I brought something to show you. He pulled out a photo album, opening it to a picture of Elizabeth at university, around the time she was pregnant with Claire. This is her, Grace gasped softly. The resemblance. It's extraordinary. Thomas, look. We see it every day, Thomas said quietly. In Claire's expressions, her mannerisms, we've always known she inherited her creative spirit from somewhere. Richard explained everything. The chance encounter on the motorway, the gradual discovery of connections, the letters Elizabeth had written every year. Grace wiped tears from her eyes as he described Elizabeth watching Claire's school plays from afar, never interfering but never stopping loving. We would have let her be part of Claire's life, Grace said, her voice thick with emotion. If we had known. Elizabeth didn't want to complicate Claire's life, Richard explained. She was so grateful that Claire had found such loving parents. But she never stopped thinking about her, never stopped writing to her. Thomas leaned forward, his expression serious. And now? What are your intentions, Mr. Blackwood? I want to tell Claire the truth, Richard replied honestly. But I want to do it right with your blessing and support. She needs all of us, her whole family, both past and present. Grace and Thomas exchanged a look that spoke of years of shared understanding. We've always kept Claire's adoption papers, Grace said, rising and walking to a bureau in the corner. We promised ourselves we'd help her find her birth mother if she ever wanted to. We just never expected. She returned with a folder, handling it with reverence. The exhibition of Elizabeth's work, Richard said carefully. I was thinking it might be the right moment, a way to show Claire her heritage through Elizabeth's art first, then reveal the personal connection. She's been so moved by Elizabeth's poetry, Grace agreed, coming to it naturally, finding the connection on her own. It's beautiful, really. We want to be there, Thomas said firmly. When you tell her, she'll need us. Need to know that this doesn't change anything about our family, it just makes it larger. Richard nodded, relief washing over him. That's exactly what I was hoping for. And there's someone else who should be there too. Elizabeth's mother, Margaret. She's been keeping Elizabeth's letters safe all these years. A grandmother, Grace smiled. Claire always wondered if she had more family out there. She'll be overjoyed. She has such a capacity for love. They spent the next hour planning, sharing stories about Claire, looking at photographs. Richard learned about Claire's first attempts at poetry, written in crayon at age 6. The Hamiltons learned about Elizabeth's secret visits to Claire's school events, her pride in her daughter's achievements from afar. As Richard prepared to leave, Grace pressed a photograph into his hands. It showed Claire at her police academy graduation, beaming in her uniform, flanked by her proud adoptive parents. For the exhibition, Grace said softly. Elizabeth's daughter became a protector of others, a keeper of peace. I think she would have loved knowing that. Standing on the doorstep, Richard turned back to them. Thank you, he said simply, for everything you've given her, for being the parents Elizabeth hoped you would be. Thank you, Thomas replied, for bringing us the missing pieces of Claire's story. And Mr. Blackwood, welcome to the family. Driving home, Richard felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The Hamiltons' blessing and support had been the final piece he needed. Now he could focus on the exhibition, on creating the perfect moment to reveal to Claire the extraordinary legacy of love that had shaped her life from the very beginning. The Bristol Literary Museum's exhibition hall buzzed with activity as Richard and Claire worked on arranging Elizabeth's life work. Display cases were being carefully filled with journals, first drafts, and personal items, each telling a piece of Elizabeth's story. For Claire, it was simply a fascinating literary project. For Richard, it was the careful construction of a revelation. I found something interesting in her journal last night, Claire said, carefully placing a handwritten manuscript in one of the cases. A poem about a baby girl. It's different from her other work, more raw somehow, like it wasn't meant for publication. Richard's hands trembled slightly as he adjusted a photograph of Elizabeth in her university days. Which one was that? Claire pulled out Elizabeth's journal, opening to a marked page. It's called First Steps. Listen, somewhere in this wide world, you're taking your first steps without me. Small feet finding their path on ground I cannot share. I write these words like breadcrumbs, hoping someday you'll find your way back to the story of your beginning, back to the heart that never stopped beating your name. She looked up at Richard, her eyes shining. It's beautiful, but so sad. Do you think she lost a child? Richard carefully placed another photograph in its display, Elizabeth at her desk, surrounded by notebooks. What makes you think that? There's so much longing in her words, Claire replied, unconsciously touching her own notebook. And I keep finding these little references throughout her work. To a girl, to missing pieces, to paths not taken. It feels personal, like she's writing to someone specific. Moving to another display case, Richard began arranging Elizabeth's collection of fountain pens, including the one Claire had been unknowingly using in their sessions, drawn to it instinctively. Elizabeth believed that every person's life was a story waiting to be discovered, he said carefully. Sometimes the most powerful stories are the ones we carry within us. Claire nodded, running her fingers lightly over the glass covering Elizabeth's first published poem. I understand that. Sometimes when I'm writing, it feels like I'm not just creating something new, I'm discovering something that was already there waiting to be found. They worked in companionable silence for a while, arranging items chronologically. Richard watched as Claire instinctively organized Elizabeth's notebooks in the exact way her mother had kept them, by size and shade rather than date. "Oh!" Claire exclaimed suddenly, picking up a small silver locket from one of the boxes. "This is beautiful." Richard's heart skipped a beat. It was the locket Elizabeth had worn when Claire was born, containing a tiny curl of baby hair. That was very special to her, he said softly. She never took it off. Claire opened it carefully, studying the tiny curl. "The same color as my hair," she mused, touching her own honey-brown waves. Then she laughed. "Listen to me, finding connections everywhere. Sometimes I feel so drawn to her story, it's almost like what?" Richard prompted gently when she trailed off. "Almost like I knew her somehow," Claire finished quietly. "Is that strange? To feel such a connection to someone you never met?" Richard adjusted his tie, buying time to steady his voice. "Not strange at all. Elizabeth had that effect on people. She could speak to their hearts even through the printed page." They continued working, and Richard noticed Claire unconsciously mirroring Elizabeth's habits, the way she would step back 3 paces to assess each display, how she'd tilt her head slightly when considering the placement of items, even her habit of humming softly while deep in thought. "I invited my parents to the opening," Claire mentioned as they finished the central display. "They're excited to see it. Dad says he's never seen me so passionate about anything except writing." "The Hamiltons are wonderful people," Richard said warmly, then caught himself as Claire looked at him in surprise. "From what you've told me about them, I mean," Claire smiled. "They really are. They've always supported my writing, even when I decided to join the police force instead of pursuing it professionally. They said I could be both, that having different parts to your life makes you a better writer." "They're very wise," Richard replied, thinking of his recent meeting with them. "Actually, Claire, there's something—" But before he could continue, the museum curator appeared, asking for Richard's input on the lighting design. By the time he returned, Claire was gathering her things to leave. "Same time next week?" she asked, carefully returning Elizabeth's journal to its display case. "We still have so much to arrange." Richard nodded, watching her go. Soon, he thought, soon she would know that the connection she felt wasn't just artistic kinship. It was the call of blood, of shared DNA, of a mother's love preserved in poetry and waiting to be discovered. He turned back to the exhibition, to the carefully arranged pieces of Elizabeth's life. In just 2 weeks, this room would become the setting for a revelation that would change Claire's life forever. Every item, every poem, every photograph was a piece of the puzzle, leading her home. Taking out his phone, he texted Margaret, "The exhibition is coming together. Claire feels the connection more strongly every day. It's almost time." Margaret's reply came quickly. "Elizabeth would be so proud of how you're handling this, both of you." Richard looked around the room one last time before leaving. Elizabeth's presence seemed to fill the space, as if she too were waiting for the moment when her daughter would finally discover the full truth of her heritage. The week before the exhibition opening brought unusually warm weather for October. Richard sat in his office at Blackwood Publishing, reviewing the final proofs of Claire's poetry collection, her first book, scheduled for release the month after the exhibition. The timing hadn't been accidental. His desk phone buzzed. "Mr. Blackwood? Officer Hamilton is here to see you." Richard looked up in surprise. This wasn't one of their usual meeting days. "Send her in, please." Claire entered, still in her police uniform, looking slightly flustered. "I'm sorry to drop by unannounced. I had to show you something." She pulled out Elizabeth's journal, the one Richard had lent her, and opened it to a page marked with a pink sticky note. "I found this last night. It's not just a poem, it's a letter. To a baby girl dated October 15th, 1981. She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "That's my birthday." Richard sat very still, his heart pounding. "What does it say?" Claire began to read. "My dearest one, today you come into this world, and I already love you more than I thought possible. Your tiny fingers wrapped around mine for just a moment, but that moment will live in my heart forever. I pray that someday you'll understand why I had to let you go, that you'll know this was an act of love, not abandonment. I dream of the woman you'll become, of the life you'll build. Know that wherever you are, whatever path you choose, my love goes with you. Like this paper holds my words, my heart will always hold you." She looked up at Richard, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "It can't be coincidence, can it? The date, the subject." "Richard, was Elizabeth Hamilton my birth mother?" The moment Richard had been carefully planning arrived unexpectedly, thrust forward by Claire's own discovery. He took a deep breath, then said softly, "Yes, Claire, Elizabeth was your mother." Claire sank into the chair across from his desk, the journal clutched to her chest. "How long have you known?" "Since that day on the motorway," Richard admitted. "You look exactly like she did at your age. And when I saw your name, your interest in poetry, I contacted Elizabeth's mother, your grandmother, Margaret. She confirmed it." "My grandmother is alive?" Claire's voice was barely a whisper. Richard nodded. "She's been keeping letters for you. Elizabeth wrote one every year on your birthday. She wanted you to have them when the time was right." "But why you?" Claire asked. Then understanding dawned in her eyes. "You said Elizabeth was your wife. You're my stepfather." "Yes," Richard confirmed gently, "though I never had the privilege of knowing you as a child. Elizabeth, she watched over you from afar. She saw your school plays, your graduation. She knew you had wonderful parents in the Hamiltons, and she didn't want to complicate your life." Claire stood suddenly, pacing the office. "The exhibition, all those poems about loss and missing pieces, the locket with the baby hair, it was all about me." "Much of it, yes." Elizabeth processed her feelings through her poetry. "But Claire," Richard leaned forward earnestly, "you should know that your parents, the Hamiltons, they know about this. I met with them last week. They're wonderful people, and they want to be part of this journey with you." Claire stopped pacing, turning to face him. "You met my parents? They love you very much," Richard said softly. "They want you to have all the pieces of your story. They're coming to the exhibition opening, and so is Margaret. We thought that would be the perfect time for everyone to come together, though you've rather jumped ahead of our carefully laid plans." A small laugh escaped Claire, though tears were running down her cheeks. "I suppose I get that from her too. Elizabeth always wrote about following the heart's intuition, not waiting for the perfect moment." Richard stood, moving around his desk, but keeping a respectful distance. "There are so many things to tell you, so many pieces to share. But first, you should know that Elizabeth never stopped loving you. Everything she wrote, everything she achieved, it was all touched by her love for you." Claire wiped her eyes, then stepped forward and hugged Richard tightly. The gesture surprised him, but he wrapped his arms around her, feeling the weight of 3 decades of separation finally beginning to lift. "I have so many questions," Claire said, stepping back but keeping hold of his hands. "About her, about you, about everything. And we have all the time in the world to answer them," Richard assured her. "Perhaps we should call Margaret and your parents. We could all have dinner together tonight, start sharing stories." Claire nodded, then looked down at Elizabeth's journal still clutched in her hand. All this time I felt drawn to her words because they were already part of me, like finding a map to my own heart. Elizabeth would say that's exactly what poetry is meant to do, Richard replied softly. Lead us home to ourselves. As he reached for his phone to make the calls that would bring their expanded family together, Richard glanced at the photograph of Elizabeth on his desk. She was smiling, surrounded by books, her pen poised over a notebook, the very image of Claire in their mentoring sessions. The circle was finally complete. The private dining room at the Bristol Arms glowed with warm lighting, creating an intimate atmosphere for what would become one of the most significant evenings in all their lives. Richard had reserved the entire space, knowing they would need privacy for the emotions and stories that would unfold. Margaret arrived first, clutching a worn leather satchel containing Elizabeth's letters. Her silver hair was elegantly styled, but her hands trembled as she arranged 25 sealed envelopes on a side table, one for each of Claire's birthdays. She had spent the afternoon reading Elizabeth's final letter to Claire, written just months before her passing, and her eyes still showed traces of tears. The Hamiltons arrived next, Grace and Thomas, carrying a photo album of Claire's childhood. They embraced Margaret immediately, years of separate love for Claire dissolving any potential awkwardness. Richard watched as Grace helped Margaret arrange the letters, while Thomas carefully placed the album beside them. She should have all of it, Thomas said quietly. Every memory, every moment, from both families. When Claire finally arrived, she paused in the doorway, taking in the scene before her. Her police uniform was replaced by a blue dress that Elizabeth had favored in a similar shade. For a moment, the resemblance was so strong that both Margaret and Richard caught their breath. Claire, Margaret stepped forward, her voice wavering. I'm your grandmother. Claire moved without hesitation, wrapping her arms around the older woman. They held each other tightly, years of separation dissolving in tears and whispered words of love. When they finally separated, Claire turned to her adoptive parents, anxiety flickering across her face. Mom, Dad, come here, sweetheart. Grace opened her arms, and Claire fell into them. Nothing changes how much we love you. Nothing ever could. We're all family now, Thomas added, joining the embrace. Just a bigger one than before. Richard watched from the side, his heart full, until Claire turned to him with a watery smile. You too, she insisted, pulling him into the group. All of my family together. They settled around the table where Richard had arranged for a feast that included all of Claire's favorite foods, which they soon discovered were identical to Elizabeth's preferences. As they passed dishes and poured wine, the stories began to flow. She used to write poetry in the margins of her police reports, Grace shared, making Margaret laugh through her tears. Elizabeth did the same thing in her university notebooks, she revealed. Her professors never knew quite what to make of it. Claire listened intently as Margaret described Elizabeth's university days, her early poetry, her dreams for the future. The Hamiltons shared stories of Claire's childhood, her first attempts at writing, her determination to help others that led her to police work, her quiet moments spent crafting verses in her room. I have something for you, Margaret said finally, reaching for the letters. Elizabeth wrote to you every birthday. She wanted you to have them when the time was right. Claire's hands shook as she accepted the first envelope, dated October 15th, 1981. Would you mind if I read it now? Of course not, darling. Grace squeezed her hand. We're all here for you. Richard watched as Claire carefully opened the envelope, unfolding the delicate paper inside. Her voice trembled as she began to read. My dearest daughter, today you are 1 day old. The nurses tell me you're perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and a head full of honey brown hair. I've held you just once, but in that moment, I memorized every detail of your face. I want you to know that giving you up is the hardest thing I've ever done, but also the most loving. I dream of the woman you'll become, of the life you'll lead. I pray that somewhere out there, a family is holding you now, giving you all the love and support I wish I could provide. I promise to write to you every year, to keep a record of my love, my hopes, my dreams for you. Whether or not you ever read these letters, know that you are carried in my heart every moment of every day. With endless love, your mother, Elizabeth. Claire wiped her eyes, looking around the table at the faces of both her families, the ones who had raised her and the ones who had waited for her. I want to read them all, she said, but not alone, together, as a family. They spent the next few hours taking turns reading Elizabeth's letters, each one capturing a year of love, hope, and quiet observation. Through Elizabeth's words, Claire discovered how her mother had watched her grow from afar, celebrating her achievements and supporting her silently through challenges. "I saw you graduate today," read one letter from Claire's university years. "You stood so tall in your cap and gown, and I saw in your face the same determination I once felt. Your poetry won the university prize. I couldn't help but buy a copy of the student magazine. Your words sing with their own voice, yet I hear echoes of my own heart in them. I've never been more proud." As the evening drew to a close, Richard raised his glass. "To Elizabeth," he said softly, "who loved so deeply that she created bridges across time, connecting all of us here tonight." "To Elizabeth," they echoed, and Claire added quietly, "My mother." Before they parted, Margaret pressed one final item into Claire's hands, a key. "To Elizabeth's writing cottage in the Cotswolds," she explained. "She left it to you in her will, though we couldn't tell you then. It's where she wrote her best work. Perhaps it's where I'll write mine," Claire finished, clutching the key. "Thank you, all of you, for keeping her memory, for raising me, for bringing us all together." They left the restaurant as one family, bound together by love that had endured separation, time, and loss. Tomorrow would bring the exhibition opening, but tonight had brought something even more precious, the weaving together of two families into one unbreakable whole. The morning of the exhibition opening dawned clear and bright. Richard arrived early at the Bristol Literary Museum, making final adjustments to the displays that now held deeper meaning for everyone involved. Each item told not just Elizabeth's story, but the story of a love that had spanned decades and generations. Claire arrived shortly after, carrying a leather-bound notebook, a gift from her adoptive parents on her 16th birthday, identical to the one Elizabeth had used for her first poetry collection. She moved through the exhibition space with new understanding, touching each item with reverence. "I never realized," she said softly, "but I've been following her path all along. Even without knowing it, I was walking in her footsteps." Richard adjusted the lighting over Elizabeth's first published poem. "She would say you were forging your own path that happened to parallel hers. She never wanted you to feel bound by her choices." They worked together, mother and daughter's poetry now displayed side by side, their similar handwriting creating a visual echo across time. Claire's newly discovered letters from Elizabeth were given their own display case, alongside photographs from both families, the Hamiltons' pictures of Claire growing up, and Margaret's collection of Elizabeth's silent presence at major events. As the first guests began to arrive, Claire retreated to the small office behind the exhibition space to change into the dress she had chosen for the occasion, a vintage piece from Elizabeth's wardrobe that Margaret had preserved. Grace helped her with her hair, while Margaret fastened Elizabeth's locket around her neck. "Something old, something borrowed," Margaret said softly, "but you, my dear, make it all new again." The exhibition space filled quickly with literary figures, local press, and members of the writing community. But at the center were two families, now one, gathering to celebrate not just Elizabeth's legacy, but the power of love to transcend time and circumstance. Richard stepped up to the podium, his heart full as he surveyed the room. "Welcome, everyone. We're here tonight to celebrate not just the work of Elizabeth Hamilton Blackwood, but the enduring power of words to connect us across time and space. Elizabeth believed that poetry was a bridge between hearts, a way to reach across the gaps that life creates between us." He paused, making eye contact with Claire, who nodded slightly. "Tonight we're also celebrating new voices, new connections. It gives me great pleasure to announce that Blackwood Publishing will be launching a new poetry collection next month by Claire Hamilton, whose work carries forward the tradition of finding beauty in life's unexpected paths." Claire stepped forward, radiant in Elizabeth's dress, her grandmother's arm linked with hers on one side, her adoptive mother's on the other. "Thank you all for being here," she began. "I'd like to read something I wrote last night, after reading 25 years of letters from my mother, Elizabeth." She opened her notebook and in the hushed room began to read, "We are written in each other's stories, ink flowing through generations like blood, words bridging the spaces between heartbeats, between choices made with love, between the mother who wrote to me for 25 years and the parents who read me stories every night, between the grandmother who kept the letters safe and the father who helped me find my way home. We are all poetry in motion, our lives verses in a greater song. And in these words, these precious words, we are all found, we are all home, we are all love. The room erupted in applause, but Richard watched the faces of their family. Grace and Thomas Hamilton holding hands tightly, Margaret wiping proud tears from her eyes, and Claire standing tall and strong, Elizabeth's daughter in every way. After the formal presentations, as guests mingled and explored the exhibitions, Richard found Claire standing before the display of Elizabeth's personal items. She was holding one of her mother's fountain pens, running her fingers over the worn silver surface. "She used this pen to write her letters to me," Claire said softly, "and now I'll use it to write my own stories." "Elizabeth would love that," Richard replied. "She always said that poetry wasn't just about writing words, it was about continuing conversations across time." "I understand that now," Claire smiled, looking around at her combined family, Margaret deep in conversation with Grace, Thomas showing Elizabeth's first additions to some literary guests. "We're all part of the same story, aren't we? It just took us a while to find all the pages." Richard watched as Claire moved through the exhibition, explaining pieces of her mother's work to interested guests, her own poetic voice blending seamlessly with Elizabeth's legacy. In her, he saw the perfect continuation of Elizabeth's story, not a replica but a harmony, a new voice carrying forward the eternal themes of love, family, and the power of words to heal and connect. The exhibition would run for 6 weeks, but its real impact would last forever in the lives it had brought together. As the evening drew to a close, Richard found himself standing before Elizabeth's portrait, her gentle smile seeming to approve of all that had transpired. "You would be so proud," he whispered. "Your daughter has found her way home, and our family is complete at last." 6 months after the exhibition, Elizabeth's writing cottage in the Cotswolds had taken on new life. Claire had maintained most of its original features, the wall of bookshelves, the antique desk by the window, the comfortable reading chair in the corner, but had added her own touches. Her police badge hung beside Elizabeth's first publishing award, symbolic of the different paths that led to the same love of helping others. The cottage had become a sanctuary for both her careers. On her days off from police work, Claire would write here, sometimes using Elizabeth's fountain pen, other times her own. She had converted the small second bedroom into a creative writing workshop space where she taught weekly classes to troubled youth, using poetry as a way to help them find their voices. "Poetry helped me find my way home," she often told her students. "It can help you find yours too." On this particular spring morning, Claire sat at Elizabeth's desk, now her desk, reviewing the final proofs of her second poetry collection. Her first book had been more successful than anyone anticipated, touching readers with its themes of identity, discovery, and the power of unconditional love. A knock at the door announced Richard's arrival. He entered carrying a large envelope and a familiar leather satchel. "The contracts from the library board," he explained, setting them on the desk, "and something else I thought you'd want to see." Claire opened the satchel and gasped softly. Inside was Elizabeth's original proposal for what would become Blackwood Publishing's community literacy program. "I found it while going through some old files," Richard said. "I thought it might help with your expansion plans." The success of Claire's writing workshops had inspired her to propose a larger initiative, turning the cottage into a full-time literary center for at-risk youth, combining Elizabeth's passion for literature with Claire's commitment to community service. "Listen to this," Claire said, reading from Elizabeth's proposal. "Books are more than paper and ink. They're bridges between souls, lifelines in difficult times, windows to possibilities we never knew existed. It's exactly what I've been trying to explain to the board." Richard smiled, settling into the reading chair. "She would be so proud of how you're building on her legacy, both as a writer and as someone who uses words to help others heal." Claire touched the locket she always wore now, the one containing both her baby hair and a small photograph of Elizabeth. "Sometimes when I'm writing here, I feel her presence so strongly, like she's guiding my hand, helping me find the right words." "You found your own words," Richard assured her, "just as she always hoped you would." Claire nodded, then turned to the contracts. The library board had agreed to partner with them on the Literary Center project, providing additional funding and resources. What had started as Elizabeth's simple writing cottage would soon become the Elizabeth Hamilton Center for Literary Arts and Healing. "Have you told Grace and Thomas about the dedication yet?" Richard asked. Claire smiled, pulling out another document. "I'm surprising them at Sunday lunch. The children's reading room will be named after them, the Hamilton Family Reading Room. After all, they're the ones who first put books in my hands, who taught me to love stories. And Margaret. The poetry workshop space will be the Margaret Wells Creative Writing Studio. She's already volunteered to help teach some of the senior citizens' classes." Claire's eyes sparkled. Who would have thought my grandmother would discover her own passion for teaching at 73? They spent the morning reviewing plans for the center's opening, scheduled to coincide with the first anniversary of the museum exhibition that had brought their family together. Already the cottage's guest book was filled with messages from aspiring writers who had found inspiration in both Elizabeth's and Claire's work. "Oh, I almost forgot," Claire said, pulling a manuscript from her desk drawer. "I found this hidden in the back of Mum's desk. It's an unfinished novel, her only attempt at long-form fiction. I've been working on finishing it." Richard took the manuscript with trembling hands. "She always talked about writing a novel, but I never knew she'd actually started one." "It's beautiful," Claire said softly. "It's about a woman searching for her voice, finding it in unexpected places. I think she was writing it for me, even if she didn't know it then." "Your mother had a way of creating ripples that would touch the future," Richard replied. "Every word she wrote carried the weight of her love forward." As the spring sunlight filled the cottage, they could hear the sounds of workers outside, preparing the grounds for the center's expansion. Soon these rooms would be filled with more voices, more stories, more healing. Elizabeth's legacy would live on not just in Claire's words, but in every life touched by the power of literature to transform and connect. Claire stood by the window, watching a young girl pass by on her way to the village, clutching a book to her chest, just as she herself had done countless times. "We all have stories waiting to be told," she said quietly. "Sometimes we just need someone to show us how to tell them." 1 year to the day after the exhibition that had changed their lives, the Elizabeth Hamilton Center for Literary Arts and Healing opened its doors. The cottage had been beautifully expanded, with glass-walled workshop spaces extending into the garden, where Elizabeth had once tended her roses. Those same roses, now carefully maintained by Margaret, bloomed in abundance, welcoming visitors to this sanctuary of words and healing. The opening ceremony brought together not just their immediate family, but the entire community that had been touched by Elizabeth's and Claire's work. Grace and Thomas Hamilton stood proudly as Claire unveiled the plaque for the children's reading room, their eyes filling with tears as she spoke about the parents who had given her the gift of stories. Margaret, elegant in Elizabeth's favorite shade of blue, beamed as she led the first poetry workshop in the studio named in her honor. "Elizabeth always said that poetry was a conversation across time," she told her students. "Today we're all part of that conversation." In the main hall, beneath a portrait of Elizabeth, Claire and Richard had created a special display. On one side was Elizabeth's final published collection, on the other, Claire's latest work. Between them sat a single book, the novel they had completed together, Elizabeth's unfinished manuscript now whole, mother and daughter's words flowing seamlessly together. As evening approached, their extended family gathered in the garden. The Hamiltons, who had raised Claire with such love, Margaret, who had kept Elizabeth's letters safe for so many years, Richard, who had helped bridge the past and present, and Claire, who had found her way home through words. Claire stood to address them, her father's gift for public speaking evident in her confident stance. "A year ago, I thought I was simply a police officer who wrote poetry in her spare time. Now I know I'm part of a greater story, one of love that transcends time, of words that heal, a family that expands beyond blood to embrace all forms of love." She turned to Grace and Thomas. "To my parents, who gave me roots and wings, who showed me that love knows no boundaries." They smiled through their tears as she continued. "To my grandmother Margaret, who kept my mother's words safe until I was ready to find them." Margaret squeezed her hand tightly. "To Richard," Claire's voice softened, "who showed me that sometimes the longest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be." Richard nodded, too moved to speak. "And to my mother, Elizabeth." Claire touched her locket. whose love was so great it created bridges across time, whose words lit the path home even when I didn't know I was searching for it. She opened a book on the podium, Elizabeth's journal from her university days. I found something here recently that seems perfect for today. Mum wrote, "Words are the threads that stitch together the fabric of our lives. Some threads we choose, others are chosen for us, but all of them create the pattern of who we become." Claire closed the journal gently. Today we open this center not just as a place of learning and creativity, but as a testament to the power of love to transcend all boundaries. Every person who comes here seeking their voice will find not just inspiration but family, just as I did. As twilight settled over the garden, Claire led them into her mother's study, now her own. On the desk sat 2 fountain pens, Elizabeth's silver one and Claire's matching gold one, gifts from Richard. Beside them lay a fresh notebook, its pages waiting to be filled. Claire picked up Elizabeth's pen and opened the notebook. On the first page she wrote the date and then below it, "Dear future writer." She paused, looking around at her family, all of them, each one essential to her story. "Every story has a beginning," she said softly, "but the best ones never really end. They just keep growing, adding new chapters, new voices, new love. Like this one," Richard added, placing a hand on her shoulder. Claire nodded, continuing to write. "Welcome to our family of words. Here you'll find your voice, your story, your path home. Because that's what Elizabeth Hamilton taught us, that words have the power to heal, to connect, to build bridges across any distance. And love has the power to write the most beautiful stories of all." She signed her name below the message, then looked up at her family with a smile. "Would anyone else like to add something?" One by one they stepped forward. Grace and Thomas, Margaret, Richard, each adding their own words of welcome, their own threads to the tapestry of love and literature that Elizabeth had begun weaving so many years ago. Outside, the roses Elizabeth had planted continued to bloom, their fragrance drifting through the open windows. Inside, her legacy lived on in every word written, every story shared, every life touched by the power of love expressed through literature. And in that moment, as Claire watched her family add their words to the notebook, she felt complete. Police officer and poet, daughter of 4 parents, keeper of 2 legacies, bridge between past and future. All of these were simply parts of her own continuing story, a story of love that had begun before she was born and would continue long after these words were written. She touched her mother's locket one last time and whispered, "Thank you for showing me the way home."